All right, our second topic today. Tunde, we saw recently an interview with Jerry Seinfeld with Barry Weiss, and essentially it was an interview. I mean, Jerry Seinfeld, generally speaking, in my impression at least, is a smart, decent guy, But the interview, was a back and forth. You got to see a lot of his thoughts on comedy, on society, and things like that. Very interesting, and like I said, puts Jerry Seinfeld, to me, not in a crazy light or anything like that. But there was a comment that he made, a comment almost seemed like a throwaway comment, but many have taken issue with it, and I find kind of insightful, in the way that it was presented as a throwaway comment, and that's just that Jerry Seinfeld indicated kind of a pining for, in the mid-century 1900s. He's promoting a movie that was based, mid-century 1900s, and just looking back and saying, oh, well, in that time period, there was a, quote, agreed upon hierarchy that society operated in. And, just pointing out that people, find comfort in hierarchies, which is something that the second part being something that's been studied, and so forth. So just, knowing history and the amount of violence and state-sponsored oppression that went on in mid-century 1900s in order to establish this hierarchy that was in place, what did you think about him calling this hierarchy agreed upon? And then how also, and then we'll also look at how whether too much attention is being given to this comment based on the fact that it was, a 15-second thought in a 30-minute interview.
Yeah. I'll answer the second part quickly. My answer is yes, but we'll discuss that later. Just to give you the quick answer, but to get
yes, you do think too much attention was given to it.
Yeah, yes, I think too much attention was given to that line over a 30-minute interview, but we'll get to that. To answer the specific first question is, I think, again, it's good because what Seinfeld did also, look, he showed some complexity in the conversation with his own mindset. There's a guy that's 70 years old and clearly seems to have read a lot and had an interest in thinking about humans and our psychology and how people have evolved. So that's why I think he spoke to that point. He said humans are uncomfortable without some sort of hierarchy. And I think he's correct in that. The other thing, you make a great point that, yes, and this is where I think sometimes we find tension in certain discussions today of things in general. Because you're right. That period of history where he is referencing, there was a lot of strife and turmoil and jockeying for the hierarchies. There were a lot of people that were put in pain because of the way these hierarchies were set up. But he's also correct in the sense that generally all hierarchies are agreed upon, even by the kind of, if I can put it this way, the lower castes, if they accept their place. Now, you have periods of history where those on the lower end of the spectrum begin to get fed up with where they are in the place and they start revolting. If you think of, the French Revolution, Cuban Revolution, the American Revolution, Civil Rights movement.
But I would also think of mid-century 1900s, though, because that's literally when the Civil Rights movement is happening. Like, how could anyone term that as an agreed-upon hierarchy when literally at that time was one of the seminal moments of pushing back in an organized fashion against a
No, that's what I'm saying is that if you look at it, if you really look back to that period, I wouldn't say the word agreed upon obviously is too broad a term. Not everyone agreed upon these hierarchies.
It's an inaccurate term is my point.
Well, okay, so I'm not going to argue that point.
There was a hierarchy. I'm not arguing that there wasn't a hierarchy. I'm just the agreed upon nature of it.
But what I'm saying is some people, even on the lower end, remember, there were a lot of people, Black Americans, that didn't like the direction of Martin Luther King and the Malcolm X's. They just thought that there would be too much backlash. Let's just continue to have this caste system, which we had in Jim Crow. Just we'll try and ask for a little bit better stuff. But so, not everybody in just the civil rights movement was agreeing on how to do it. That means some people agreed with their station in the hierarchy. You and I might not agree with that, but some people obviously did. So
counterpoint to that, though, is that there were many people who were, and a lot of people, including Jewish Americans and many Jewish Americans, white Americans, who did not agree with the nature of the hierarchy and the way the hierarchy was being enforced as well. So you can't selectively say that some Black people were cool with it, and so therefore it's an agreed upon hierarchy.
No, that's ignore
the people who. Oh, okay. Go ahead.
And that's what I'm saying is that the term agreed upon, that's what I mean. It's obviously too flat of a term and it's not nuanced enough. But what I'm getting at, and maybe a better point for me to make is the majority group had an agreed upon hierarchy. You're right. The civil rights movement is where more from the majority group and then enough from the minority group came together to make the changes that we saw, right? And I think that's what he's alluding to is since that period, there hasn't been an agreed upon hierarchy in the United States because there's been tension between things that we've talked about in prior discussions on the show, which is the culture of things like manifest destiny or white supremacy in the American historical culture versus the people that have been fighting for equality. Up until the civil rights era, one side was dominating that hierarchy.
But again, it wasn't agreed upon. If one side dominates it with murder and violence and terrorism, I don't see how anyone.
Well, what I said was, remember, I clarified it, but I clarified it by saying agreed upon by the majority group until the 1960s represented when enough from the majority group decided, hey, maybe we shouldn't have the hierarchy in this way. And now there is no majority group kind of, dominating things. So everyone's jockeying for this hierarchy.
I don't think you can save it. I mean, what you're saying to me is nonsensical. It's nonsensical. I mean, there was no agreed upon hierarchy when John Brown in the 1840s and 1850s is fighting for abolitionism and running in with guns.
But under that definition, James, there's never been an agreed upon hierarchy. We could say that the Martin Luther was an example of rebelling against that hierarchy of Catholic Church.
I would say. Okay, then let's follow down that path because yes, there's friction in societies where if you want to talk about an agreed upon hierarchy, what you need to do is go to smaller groups. If you're saying over a society, there's an agreed upon hierarchy, that would be very rare in society. What he's doing, what Seinfeld's doing, again, I think he seems like a decent guy, a smart guy, but what he's doing is taking his juvenile understanding of the 1950s or whatever and trying to import that into his adult understanding of what's happening now and compare the two. We've talked about this before. When you look through nostalgic lenses, things look simpler in the past, not because they were simpler in the past, but because you were simpler in the past because you were young. If you're 10 years old, then of course everything looks agreed upon and everything that's the way it is because you have no context, no perspective, and you don't see the depth of what's happening in society. So to me, this is a error, a fallacy that we see people fall into where they look back at the past, either when they learned about something or when they observed it, and they themselves were a simpler person in saying, oh, okay, yeah, good and bad, evil, and, like the good guys and the bad guys and everything like that. They didn't appreciate the complexity of what was going on. But then as he remembers it, and he sees all the complexity now. And it's like, man, it was so much simpler then than it is now. But it's not. It's only because he recognizes the complexity now. And when he looked back, he didn't recognize the complexity then. So that to me is just it's a logical error. It's an error in remembering and not correcting for the fact that you yourself are not the same when you observe something when you're 10 to when you observe something when you're 70, so to speak. So, and in terms of humans being more comfortable in a hierarchy, I wouldn't disagree with that. I think that sports are good. Sports always give good examples of these things. If you put, 15 guys in a basketball locker room or even more, if you put 50 or 60 or 70 guys in a football locker room, they will kind of sort out a hierarchy. And a lot of times that will be an agreed upon hierarchy, but it's not something oftentimes that's going to be enforced with perpetual violence and oppression. That's when you have to use violence and oppression to keep the hierarchy in place. It's not agreed upon. That's kind of the whole point.
Let me jump in because I see what you're saying. I'm not disagreeing with you. I just think he was talking about something different because they did have a moment in there where they said, yeah, what was going on in the civil rights movement, certain things were bad at that time.
All the murder and hangings and stuff, besides all that.
And then he said also...
What?
No, but he said, but this is where I think, again, this is where nuance comes in, right? And obviously we're interpreting what we think the guy's talking about. So none of us know unless we interview him. But the thing is that you're not incorrect with what you're saying. Because the thing about nostalgia and all that is very true. All of us... think of when we were kids, everything was simpler because life was simpler for us as children. But I think that he made a point because he did speak to certain things. He's in the mid 20th century when he was a kid, because what it goes to is what I think we've identified in different ways in various discussions of what's going on with some of this culture war stuff is back then there was just less choices for media consumers and consumers of the culture in general. Because what he said was, I miss when a real man was a real man type of thing. And he had
the dominant masculinity
joke.
piece, which was a separate piece, though. Some people have jumped
that's
onto
what
that
I'm saying.
as well.
And he did make a joke. He goes, yeah, except for the toxic masculinity stuff. And what he was saying, he said, and I wrote down 3 names that he said. He said, looking at people, when I was a kid, I could look up at a man like Walter Cronkite, who told us the news every night, you know, and the Americans trusted him. He said Sean Connery and Muhammad Ali, specifically those 3 guys.
But the first name he said was JFK.
Good point. That I did miss that one. And so but what made me realize, was obviously a president's a president, but when you think about Walter Cronkite, Muhammad Ali, or Sean Connery, whether he did this on purpose or not is interesting because they cover the other big parts of our media culture, right? News, sports, and then movies and film and entertainment. And I feel like, if I'm thinking back to those days, even just as a person now, just thinking back to it, there was a lot. I mean, it was Sean Connery or someone like Clint Eastwood in the Westerns, but, you know, that was there was a certain manly man in film. Then you had your athletes who was either going to be a football player or, you know, a Jim Brown or Muhammad Ali. And then you only had a couple, you know, Walter Cronkite was the main guy on the news. I'm sure you had a few others, but he was pretty much it. So I think when you're talking about the hierarchy, that's, I think, what he was alluding to as well. Again, not to say what you were saying is incorrect. It's more of saying that culturally we had less choices. So it was easier to go out, like as a young person, I could just go say, okay, boom, there goes an example of a real man. Whereas today, young people going on YouTube, they got a million cable channels, they got the Snapchat, they got TikTok. So there's a lot of different examples of what it is to be anything today. And young people are choosing to follow all kind of stuff. So there doesn't appear to be an agreed upon anything anymore. And that's where I look at more his kind of comments were going versus coming from somewhere like he's saying, I'm just oblivious to the downsides of what happened in the middle of the 20th century. I don't think he was alluding to that.
Well, that may be the case. I mean, obviously, you know, like you're taking the position of wanting to defend it, you know, like I said, and even like I said, I'm
not really defending it.
Well,
let me
get the thought out. I think you're actually looking for reasons to either interpret what he says in a charitable way or whatever. But beyond that, let me throw something at you. And I know we can't go on this forever. But let me throw something at you because I don't think that him saying this, like, this doesn't seem to be a hostile statement. Like I said, for me, it seems misguided more than anything. But agreed upon hierarchy, you know how you can get an agreed upon hierarchy is if everyone buys into something like a constitution. And then you have votes based on and as laid out by this constitution. And then if you win, then everybody says, okay, here, this person's going to be our leader. We agree that this is what's going to happen. And if you lose, you say, okay, well, this, you know, I'll concede this person won. That is an example of an agreed upon hierarchy that our founding fathers tried to set up and put in place. And it naturally talks about consent of the government, a government that is consent of the governed. And so if you want to talk agreed upon hierarchy, it's not impossible, but it's usually about a system that we can all agree to. It agreed upon hierarchy, so to speak. The NBA finals are about to happen. The whole league has agreed that if you go through this certain gauntlet and you win these games, they will acknowledge you. Now, there are people pushing against an agreed upon hierarchy right now, but they're the ones saying that, oh, well, if I lose an election, I'm just going to call it rigged. Or if I lose a court, we think that if juries of peers convict people, then they are felons and that should be a big deal. If people pushing against that hierarchy would be, no, if I get convicted, it was rigged, so to speak. So I think that examples of an agreed upon hierarchy are all around us. And the people that are pushing against these agreed upon hierarchies, we don't seem to recognize that they're pushing against the agreed upon hierarchy. The agreed upon hierarchy isn't just, this is what it is. It's usually a system. Here is a way we will approach this, and then we'll live with the results, whether they favor us or not. That wasn't necessarily what was in place in 1950. But that is underlying a lot of the system that we have now, if we can keep it, so to speak.
Yeah. And well, I mean, I think that's where the kind of long arc of it comes in, is that in the 50s, there was a certain hierarchy. And like you said, not everyone agreed upon it, but enough people did that it kept a lid on, let's say 1950s and prior. It kind of kept a lid on everyone else. But the 60s represented that hierarchy and kind of got toppled in a certain way, but not other ways. And so this, I think what he's referencing to is kind of this cultural tension we have as the country, as the nation looks to build whatever the new hierarchy is going to be if it gets set in stone. And to your point, there's people now that have taken to maybe started with certain things they didn't like about the upending of certain hierarchies, and that's gone to other areas of society that has its own, that have their own hierarchical stances. And I think, just to finish up on the prior question about some of the reaction to Jerry Seinfeld that I've seen, yeah, I mean, I've seen it as more, it's calling him a villain and all this. And I think, look, everyone's entitled to their opinions, but I was expecting a lot more based on some of the commentary I saw when I watched that interview than what I saw. Because what I generally saw was just looked like a cordial conversation between two people and someone interviewing a famous comedian who spent most of his time talking about how he feels about life and stuff like that. So
yeah,
I think,
but you got to be careful though, because words matter, and you say leadership matters, but I'd say you're going beyond that. Words matter in the sense that even what you just did just there, before the 1960s, people kept a lid on the discontent in the hierarchy, but that kept a lid on it is called lynching. It's called there's a lot of vile things. And so saying they kept the lid on it kind of minimizes all that and just says, oh yeah, almost puts that in, good thing they kept the lid on it then, because then people were more comfortable in society, or some people were more comfortable in society. And I think we just got to be really careful when we talk about that, because if we're looking back, if we want to say, hey, let's agree on a system, which the founding fathers did, so to speak, and then say, let's try to live up to this system. That can be how we establish this hierarchy, because we do need to. There needs to be a hierarchy. Everybody can't just walk around doing whatever they want to do all the time in a society of people. Human beings don't operate like that. Again, humans will naturally form hierarchies. Like you play sports, I play sports. Like in those locker rooms, hierarchies form automatically. You don't have to try to do it. They automatically form. Like you put groups of people together, hierarchies form. And as the groups get larger and larger and you want to try to maintain these systems, you have to set up mechanisms in place to maintain these to establish and maintain these hierarchies. But we can't look back at times when they're maintained with violence and oppression and say, oh yeah, those were the good old days. And that's kind of my overall point.
No, I know. But this is a good example of why in today's world, you just can't have a conversation, because me saying put a lid on something in a conversation that's going a certain, in a certain pace was specifically to avoid trying to jarble it up with certain things that I assumed were already known. And I'm not saying this to you personally. I'm more saying this is the problem with the internet discourse. It's a good example of why I said the reaction to Jerry Seinfeld negatively, I think, was a little bit too much.
Well, but do you think it's a virtue to minimize the fact that a lid was
it's not a minimize it.
Well, no, I genuinely want to ask you, to minimize the idea, kept a lid on it. Does that you're saying that doesn't imply negative or positive? But should we whitewash the negative way that a lid was kept on things?
Well, I'm just saying, in a conversation like ours, right? And not to say an academic conversation, or if I was a professor in a university right now talking about that period of time, that might be a different story where it'd be better for me to go into more nuance. But in the conversation of you and I personally, and then on the show, which if people have been watching the show, they kind of know what we're about. I didn't feel the need to sit there and have to explain, well, due to the nature of the way that people behaved with lynchings and beatings and having jelly bean things, that counting at polls and excluding people from participating in their constitutional rights, and that might not have fit good with the way the conversation was flowing and would have distracted from just kind of moving on. And that's my point of that's why this whole internet era of somebody just trying to talk and have a conversation, you got millions of people that'll go in there and start picking apart what the person's saying because they either didn't say enough or they said too much. And I think this Seinfeld...
Well, I don't think it's that. It's not that you said too much or too little, because it literally is. You can say the whole thing and people still can take a piece of it and say, hey, I want to talk about this one piece. But and I'll finish with this, just saying that I appreciate your sentiment there. The issue that we have is just that it's hard. If you want to have understanding, it's hard to remove complexity, while at the same time, complexity by its definition makes things more complicated to talk about, makes things more difficult to talk about. So everybody's trying to walk this line of how much complexity do we need. And, sometimes, people object if you try to flatten it a little bit for the purposes of, making the point. And then other times you put all the complexity in, and people still might just take a segment out. So, but I think we can wrap this segment from there. We appreciate everybody for joining us on it. And we'll be back with our final segment here shortly.